And again, welcome. And as I say almost every time now, any comments, any thoughts that you might have that you want to post in the comments section, just know I appreciate it. It is nice to know if you find these interesting. I see some of you, uh, signing on more than once, and just to know if you find these interesting. And of course, your very presence says something. So know that I appreciate it. But certainly this, as you can see, it's a process of communication and conversation, and perhaps that's what it's all about too, right? As we try to understand our relationship to the universe through the Torah and the creator of, if we can use such a term, right? I mean, it goes so far beyond creation even. So
yeah, Rabbi, where can I find a red cow so I can get purified?
Yes, the great mystery, and it has to be pure. So the problem is the person who's preparing the cow has to have a certain level of purity too. And it's interesting that you asked that question. Let me make a bracha, Harlan, and then I will actually make a comment on that question you just asked. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So I understand that clearly one has to be very careful if you're going to be in a state of purity to perform the rituals of the red heifer, to never come in contact, even to be under the same canopy as a dead body. And so there are apparently children, there are very, very observant families that raise their children in such a way that they will be in such a state where they have never been under the same canopy. That apparently there are people who are so observant who try to make sure, just in case they can find such a red heifer, red cow. And of course, it can't have a black hair in it or stuff. It has to be absolutely perfect. And so it's very, very rare that you find such an animal. And maybe there's a message in that as well. So I'm going to go to the share now, and we're going to proceed with what we're in the midst of. And we were in remember, we're still finishing up this area here of how to deal with the spoil of Midian. So atem ushvichem, you and your captives. This was referring to the act of purification of tumat mate, of the kind of impurity brought about through a corpse. And it's interesting that it isn't just Israelites who have to go through this purification, it's also your captives. Lo shehanochrim mekablim tuma. So it's interesting that Rashi says it's not that non-Jews can receive tuma, can become impure. It's interesting, right? Only Israelites can become impure. Non-Israelites are not subject to this particular state, spiritual state. V'tzrichim haza'ah, or require the sprinkling of the ashes, etc. Ella ma atem b'nei brit, right? But in the fact that you are children of the covenant, right? So you can understand, just as in passing, the significance of the Brit Milah and the understanding of what we mean when we talk about this Brit, Brit Avraham, this covenant of Abraham, that I believe this is an opinion based on some material that I've read, but I don't know that I've actually read it explicitly, that this has to do with immortality. And of course, it also has to do with promiscuity and things like that, and acting in a very modest way throughout our lives, and that is connected to immortality, and that this brit has to do with a certain degree of immortality. Not that other nations do not have immortality, We have a famous statement that is, I've heard quoted often in my life, Tzadikei umot ha'olam, the righteous of the nations of the world, yesh lahem chelek ba'olam haba. They have, a portion in the world to come. So, at any rate, going on with what Rashi's trying to tell us, is that just as you are children of this covenant, af shvichem kesheyavo'u lebrit, okay, when they also enter the covenant, vayitma'u, and when they become impure, tzrichim haza'ah, they also will require this sprinkling of the ashes of the red heifer. So it's not saying, the way Rashi appears to be understanding this sentence to mean not that the individuals who were brought into captivity from the Midianites require sprinkling immediately, but when they convert to Judaism, when they become part of the Israelite people, they will also require, if they become impure in such a way, they will also require this sprinkling. And the fact that that is the case, and that we're reading in the sentence how it's connected to entering the covenant, and again, the idea of being sprinkled with the ashes of the red heifer when you've come in contact with a corpse, again, has this connection. I don't know if you can follow me and connect the dots, that we must be talking about death and immortality, that there is some allusion there and suggestion there of immortality. So, going on. V'chol beged, not only this, but any clothing, v'chol klior, so a beged would be made out of fiber, klior would be made out of leather, right, of a skin, v'chol ma'aseh izin, and anything from goats, so it could be talking, Rashi may clarify this, but we could be talking about goat hair here. That's used from goat hair. V'chol klei eitz, and any vessel made out of wood, titchata'u, that's the pausal form of this word, you shall also sprinkle. So kalim, vessels also, are subject to tum'ah. So let's see here. So Rashi does help us here. And he says, so why, if we were talking about goat hair, we've already mentioned fibers, so why are we going in that direction? And this is from Torat Kohanim, which would mean the Midrash on Leviticus, right? Lahavi klei hakornaim, that is to include vessels made out of their horns, v'hatlafim, or from their hoofs, v'ha'atzamot, and also from their bones. That if something, and basically I think we're talking about not the fact that there might not be other animals from which one makes these particular vessels, because one might even do it obviously from a cow. In other words, any kosher animal to make such vessels, etc. I suspect that the Torah is giving an example that one might extrapolate as to these things requiring this sprinkling if they come in contact with a corpse. We are now getting to the commentary that and the verse that I had mentioned I really love, and that's this starred Rashi right here. But let's read the verse first. Vayomer Elazar HaKohen, and Elazar the Kohen, remember Elazar was one of the two sons of Aaron that remained after Nadab and Abihu died, right? So he was now the high priest because Aaron had passed on. El Anshe Hatzava, he said to the men of the armed services, right? Habaim la milchama. In other words, they had been selected to serve and come into battle, who came into the war, into the battle. Zot hukat haTorah. This is the law of the Torah. And notice, by the way, that it says chok, And we also talked about the ashes of the red heifer as being a chok, and that we understand chukim as arbitrary laws, that a chok is a law made by our ruling authority, in this case, of course, God, that isn't necessarily subject to reasoning. In other words, when it says thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, etc., we understand that society, the security of society depends on the observance of such laws. But there are also laws that are called chukim within Judaism, such as kashrut, which are simply, society clearly doesn't depend on such laws, but they are, I believe, they are laws that are in the Torah to clearly demonstrate our love of God. That when you observe these kinds of laws, we are saying to God, we love you so much. The fact that you told us to do this is good enough. And that in fact applies, of course, between people as well. That is a wonderful way of expressing love for the person you love. So, Zot Chukat HaTorah, Asher Tziva Hashem et Moshe. So interesting. Moses is around. It's not that he isn't around, but Elazar says, which God commanded Moses. Such an interesting statement, because that raises a question that Rashi is immediately going to answer, and I think his answer is memorable. Certainly, I haven't forgotten it. So the question, of course, is why isn't Moses saying this? I mean, how many laws do we know that we've already studied when God tells Moses to tell the Israelites? And why is it Elazar here who's telling them and also saying it in the name of Moses? And this is the Rashi. Here goes. Vayomer Elazar HaKohen, etc. And Elazar, the priest, said, Lefi, so Rashi explains, Lefi sheba Moshe lichal klaas, because Moses became angry. Remember, it said that Moses became angry when he saw the chieftains. He became angry at the chieftains regarding the people they brought back, and that some of the women, right, who had actually caused this whole predicament, right, were still there amongst the people, the captives. But Moses got angry, and it says that, right? And Rashi is telling us that because Moses became angry, lichlal ka'as, ba lichlal ta'ut, automatically he now became into a place of error. That when you become angry, your rational faculties are suppressed. And so he no longer was capable of thinking as clearly and focused as he might have if he wasn't angry. And because Moses became angry, he automatically also came into a place of error. Shenit almu, I'll keep going, I need to go to the next word, mimenu, halchot geulei nochrim. That is to say, that the laws regarding the cleansing of vessels that were taken from non-Jews, that they go through a process of koshering. So here we are reading in the Torah the requirement to kosher dishes before you actually use them, but we also, in general, the laws of koshering dishes, he couldn't remember them. Moses was unable to remember these laws. V'chein atamot says. So Rashi goes on to give another example. And Lauren, I'm sorry, I do recognize you. Yes.
Well, do you want to finish this and then I'll get to my question? Because
Yes.
you're real into this one. And
thank you. And it's fairly long, so I do want to get it done, but I also want to hear your question, obviously. So thank you. And you find a similar situation on the 8th day of the dedication of the Mishkan, right? And that is, remember, we know that when Aaron experienced the death of his 2 sons, they were supposed to consume a sin offering that was brought on behalf of the community, and apparently they didn't. and Moses got angry with them for having not done it, right? And we read about Aaron's beautiful response. And we did cover this because it says back in Leviticus chapter 10, that's where we're reading about the dedication of the sanctuary, of the Mishkan, Vayiktsov Moshe al Elazar. It may not actually have the word Moshe back in that verse. These parentheses sometimes indicate an addition that shouldn't be there. So in the text, that Moses got angry at Elazar, the Al Itamar, and to Itamar. By implication, by the way, that's a euphemism. It means he really got angry with Aaron. But the text doesn't want to say that because it's so disrespectful when Aaron is the high priest. So it says Moses got angry at Elazar and Itamar. But it actually does mean he got angry with Aaron. Ba lechlal kas. And so because he got angry, ba lechal ta'ut, he also entered a place of error. His mind became unclear. And so we see there that a law of some kind is not given to him. I think it was given to Aaron. I'd have to go back and check. It's a detail, right? A third place, B'midbar Kaf, in Numbers 20, which is the one example which everybody is aware of, and you could probably tell me it, right?
Is that Exodus 20?
No, this is Numbers 20.
Oh, okay.
The story of the rock, right? When he splits the rock, that's that third time that Rashi's mentioning, where it says how Moses got angry, and he says to the Israelites, the assembled Israelites, Shim'u na hamorim. He says, "Hear you rebels." He addresses them as rebels. Vayach et hasela, and he struck the rock. And remember, God had explicitly told him to speak to the rock, but he got so angry, he struck the rock. Al yedei hakas ta'a. Because he got angry, he made a mistake. What a beautiful and significant piece about anger. Let me just finish this up. There's just a little bit more. Asher tziva Hashem. This is referring to Elazar saying, which God commanded Moses, right? And this is from the Sifrei. Tala ha'ora'ah berabo. He acknowledged, right? He gave an acknowledgement that this halacha that he was teaching, this learning, this piece Elazar was teaching, actually came from his master, meaning Moses. So he gave Moses the credit for the teaching. Okay, Lauren.
Well, now I have two things.
Well, great.
So I was just, I mean, the reason I thought it was Exodus because it says Bamidbar, which I thought was Exodus.
No, that's Numbers. Shemot is Exodus.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm just getting confused because they were in the wilderness during. Okay, but so the other question was about koshering dishes.
Yes.
Coming from Gentiles. Does that mean like, I mean, just thinking practically, if you buy a new set of dishes that are wrapped,
yes,
I mean, A, do you have to kosher them? And B, if the company is owned by a Jewish person, you don't, or,
right. Okay.
Or do you not have to anyway if they're new or?
Yes, of course. So this is, you're asking a very, very good question. So you understand why they need to kosher these dishes, because the Midianites didn't keep the laws of kashrut. They would mix milk with meat. They would eat any kind of food in them. So the dishes required koshering. So of course we now hear when Pesach comes along, if we need to kosher dishes, the basic principles are found in these particular passages. And okay. Now to answer your question. So I would say that biblically, if the dishes are new, you wouldn't need to kosher them. However, rabbinically, you're right. In fact, if the dishes are bought from a non-Jewish concern, they actually go through a process of koshering, not this kind of koshering that they're going to talk about, where, for example, you know that if you want to kosher a stove or some kind of pot or saucepan that is actually put on the fire, you have to raise it to red heat, etc. But there is, in fact, in St. Louis, there is a special mikveh that's called for the dishes. So it's just used to take dishes. And some of the very observant Jews will take their new dishes and they will immerse them in the mikveh. I think that it's not just a question, I think, of the fact that there is an allusion to this particular mitzvah that is mentioned here. I think there's another reason too, as to, first of all, the reasons for kashrut. Even though we realize that the laws of kashrut are basically a chok, nevertheless, our tables, right? When you sit down at a table, at a meal, there is a sense that is an altar. That being able, right, there's a wonderful statement that says that the fact that people are able to be fed every single day is more miraculous than the crossing of the Red Sea. And that's, I think, a very profound and great statement, that we should not take for granted the complexity and the variety and the holiness of being able to enjoy a meal. And so that when you sit at a table and you're eating away, to understand that you are actually sitting at an altar, that this is actually a holy act. You can transfer a very basic necessity into a sanctified act. And that's why you make a bracha before you eat. It's one, I mean, there are more than one reason for making the bracha, but that's why there are blessings before you eat the food, and why there are blessings after you eat the food. And there, as you know, before you eat bread, there is a make hamotzi. You're supposed to wash your hands in a ritual way after you've washed them, to cleanse them hygienically, etc. It's all a way of trying to make us conscious that despite the fact that we no longer have a temple, there are still echoes in our own lives, even today, of the altar. Because sometimes the altar is called the table of God, and an altar is essentially a table. And so a table where you eat is a sacred place. And these particular mitzvot have to do with putting into action the sense of its sanctity.
So even if you buy dishes from a non-kosher Jew or a vegan who's not Jewish, or even from a kosher Jew, it still couldn't hurt to go through this ritual for the reasons of ritual purification, even if it's not necessarily been touched by some kind of unkosher.
Correct. It's symbolic more than practical. Here it's practical. Here in this particular case that we're reading about, it's practical. And that's why it's a biblical commandment here. Look, I'm not going to tell you that I've ever taken my new dishes to the mikveh. But then again, my understanding of these levels of observance are that in a way it's a privilege. That there are in fact mitzvot that to be able to practice mitzvot is a privilege. And I might, if I were to start practicing all the mitzvot that I'm aware of, I would drive my family crazy. And it's a lesson that God had to teach me, that when you do these things, it's not an automatic thing. And so there are ways. So if, for example, our dishwasher now is strictly used for milchik dishes. But when I first got married, we used to separate the dishes, to say that we never mixed the milk and meat dishes in the dishwasher, but we did use the dishwasher for milchik dishes. We'd wash the milchik dishes separately, and then we'd wash the fleishik dishes, but we'd use the same dishwasher. And at this point, Susie felt, it actually came from her, that we should just dedicate the dishwasher for milchik dishes, because we use milchiks most of the time. Then when Pesach comes, because we eat more fleishiks at Pesach, so the Seder, for example, what we do is we kosher the dishwasher by running it through a couple of times, and then we just use it for fleishik dishes. But otherwise, we try to do these things so that, I think it's good to, if I may use the term, to use an organic approach to practicing halakha. So it has to do with your background, and I like to compare, like if you try to take on everything at one time, it's like putting boiling water over very cold glass. You shatter. It doesn't work that way. We learn these things, we process these things, and we see where there are opportunities to perform these things. And it is a privilege. So, but I also want to be honest, at least as honest as I can be, about my own practice of these things. So I like to talk about a halachic consciousness because, of course, many Jewish people do not have a sense of halakha. I'm not blaming them or anything. That's not where I'm coming from. But it takes time. And if you're not raised in this particular environment, to become aware that there is something called halakha that has a serious place in our lives, and then to try and create a relationship to seeing life in that particular way. Should I go on, or does anybody want to comment? Okay, all right. So I'll go on a little bit, one more sentence, and then I think that's all the time we have for. So, ach et hazahav, he says, however, the gold, the et hakesef, and the silver, the et hanachoshet, and the copper or the bronze, the et habarzel, and normally barzel we translate as iron, right? The et habedil, dil would be lead. Maybe bedil would be the tin. The et haoferet, I believe oferet is lead. Okay, so pewter dishes made out of these various metals, right? Let's see if there's a Rashi on this. Yes. Ach et hazahav. So we're going to catch this sort of in the middle, I'm afraid. We'll have to go back if we can't get much further. Only the gold, etc. Af al pi shelo hizhir lachem ela al hilchot tumat. Okay. Even though he has only given them the precautions regarding the laws of Tumah, spiritual impurity, Od yesh lahazir lachem. We still need to tell you, right? To basically, these are negative commandments that we're going to be talking about. Al hilchut giul. We still have, the negativity is the removal of any treif, any unkosher material that these vessels may have absorbed. So giul has to do with the process of removing unkosher absorbed food in the vessels. The ach lashon miut. He says this term ach that we use here, ach, right, has the connotation of something being left out, of basically it's saying certain things are included, certain things are not included. Klomar, so he's, what is this ach doing here? Memu'atim atem, right? He says this ach has the function of saying that you are excluded, right? It's an exclusionally. When you use the term but, you're excluding something. So he says, you are excluded, milehishtamesh bekalim, to make use of vessels, afilu la'achar taharatam mitum atamet. Even though you may have sprinkled on them the ashes of the red heifer and taken care of this impurity, the spiritual impurity that is created by them being in contact with a dead body, ad sheyitaharu mibliat isur nevelot. You cannot use them until they have been cleansed, they've been purified from the absorption of forbidden food. In other words, a nevela is an animal essentially that is not shechted, that if it is not slaughtered according to the laws of shechting, it is considered a nevela, right? It's still not kosher. Not only is it not kosher, it also actually creates a spiritually impure situation. Different kind of thing. The Rabotenu Amru, and our sages said, Ach et hazahav, the reason why it says, ach, the gold, right, but the gold, lomar, to tell you, shetzarich lahavir chaluda shelo kodem shigalenu. So again, remember this ach is removing something, and the rabbis understood it to mean that if there's any rust or like oxidation on the vessel, that needs to be removed. Chaluda is the word that we use for rust, right? So that if there's any kind of oxidation or this kind of incrustation on the vessel, it has to be removed prior to its going through this geula here of being cleansed from the impurity, from the absorptions. Vezehu lashon ach, right? And this is the connotation of the word ach. Shelo yehe sham chaluda. So in other words, something is removed. That's what the ach is saying. And the ach et hazahav means that we've removed something off the gold, right? To tell you, shelo yehe sham chaluda. There should not be any incrustation there. I'm going to say rust, although I don't think gold rusts as such, right? Ach hamatecha, but only the metal. Matechet is the metal. Yeh kamotchahu should be there alone, right? Just in its pristine state. That's what that would imply. So I think it's a good place for us at this point to stop. And I'll mark it here. Stop the share. Oh, sorry. Whoops. Okay. All right. Any comments before I stop the recording? So, all right. I will stop the recording. Take care and thank you.